There is a mound in Ireland 1,000 years older than Stonehenge, engineered by Stone Age farmers to catch the sunrise on a single day of the year, and it still works. There are Viking houses in Canada that prove someone reached America 500 years before Columbus. And there are bronze masks in China from a civilization the history books didn't know existed. Every one of these places did the same thing. It forced historians to rethink what they thought they knew about the human past, because the story we were taught is suspiciously simple. Primitive ancestors, slow and steady progress. But these 7 places snap that line in half. Every time, the textbook said one thing and the ground said something that shouldn't have been possible. By the end of this video, you'll look at the people who came before us with completely different eyes. Let's start on a quiet green hill in Ireland, where farmers reached up to catch the sun. Get one. Newgrange, the Stone Age farmers who captured the sun. On a low green rise in the Boyne Valley of Ireland sits a giant grassy mound, about 280 feet across, ringed with massive carved curbstones. For centuries, locals thought it was just a fairy hill, a bump in a farmer's field wrapped in old legends. It is one of the most important buildings on Earth, and it rewrote what we thought Stone Age people were capable of. Newgrange was built around 3200 BC. Stop and let that land. That's 1,000 years before Stonehenge, and 500 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. When the first pharaoh was born, Newgrange was already ancient. It was raised by Neolithic farmers, people with no metal, no wheel, no writing, who hauled an estimated 200,000 tons of earth and stone. Some of it carried from miles away, and engineered it into a structure so sound it has stood, watertight, for 5,000 years. But the age isn't even the part that breaks the rules. This is. Above the entrance, the builders left a small slot in the stone, a roof box, and once a year, on the dawn of the winter solstice, the rising sun shines through that slot, runs down the 60-foot passage, and floods the inner chamber with light for about 17 minutes. Then the dark returns for another year. It is not an accident. It is precise. These farmers 5,000 years ago understood the movement of the sun across the year so exactly that they built a machine of stone to catch a single sunrise, and aimed it perfectly enough that it still works today. Here's why that rewrites the textbook. We file the people of 3200 BC under primitive. Simple farmers scratching at the dirt. Newgrange says they were astronomers, mathematicians, and master engineers who could track the heavens and pour that knowledge into a 100,000-ton instrument. Their bodies are gone, their language is gone, even their names are gone, and yet every December the sun still keeps the appointment they built for it. We didn't invent the precision-aligned monument. They beat us to it by 5,000 years on a hill in Ireland with stone tools. Quick question before we go on, because I genuinely read these. Do you think a structure like this was built to honor the dead, mark the new year, or something we haven't guessed yet? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me what country you're watching from. I'm curious how far this reaches, because the next site doesn't rewrite when people got clever. It rewrites who our ancestors even were. 2. Sanxingdui. The civilization China didn't know it had. For 100 years, the story of Chinese civilization was settled. It was born on the Yellow River with the Shang dynasty, and everything radiated outward from that one heartland. Tidy, agreed upon, in the textbooks. Then in southwestern China, in Sichuan, 1,000 miles from that heartland, workers digging clay opened 2 pits in the ground, and what came out should not have existed. Thousands of objects, deliberately smashed and burned and buried, towering bronze masks with eyes that bulge out on cylinders, ears swept back like wings, faces that look nothing human and nothing Chinese, closer to something from another world. Gold foil masks, a bronze tree 8 feet tall, a life-size statue of a nobleman. This was Sanxingdui, a Bronze Age city of tens of thousands, 3,000 years old, that sprawled across 12 square kilometers with walls and canals and an entire artistic language no one had ever seen. Here's the part that rewrote the books. It was a sophisticated civilization that flourished completely separate from the Yellow River cradle, advanced enough to rival it, and the textbooks never knew it was there. No ancient text mentions it. It left no writing of its own. It existed for only about 350 years, and then vanished. And the craftsmanship makes it worse, not better. These bronzes were larger and stranger than anything in the ancient world at the time, cast with a sophistication that still astonishes modern metallurgists. By a culture the history books didn't even list as a player. And the deepest question is the one we can't answer. Why did they smash everything they made, burn it and bury it in pits? A ritual? A disaster? A people erasing themselves on purpose before they disappeared? Nobody knows. An entire advanced civilization hidden under Chinese fields that rewrote a century of accepted history. And we don't even know its name in its own tongue. So much for the straight line. But the next site does something almost stranger. It takes a story everyone was certain was pure fiction and digs it up out of the ground. 3. Troy, when a myth turned out to be real. For most of modern history, scholars were certain of one thing. Troy was a fairy tale, the city of Homer, of the wooden horse, of Achilles and Helen. Pure poetry, a bedtime story for the ancient Greeks. No serious historian believed there was a real city under all that myth. Then a businessman named Heinrich Schliemann, obsessed with Homer since childhood, went digging on a mound in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik and hit walls, real walls. Then another city beneath those, and another beneath that. Layer on layer of a real fortified city, burned and rebuilt, over and over across thousands of years, sitting exactly where Homer said Troy stood, guarding exactly the strategic strait the legend described. Now be careful here. And this is where honesty matters. Finding Troy doesn't prove the Trojan War happened the way Homer sang it, or that any single hero was real. Schliemann himself was a showman who damaged the site and overclaimed. But the core fact rewrote the rules anyway. A place everyone had filed under myth was physically, undeniably real. And that forced a much bigger question on every scholar after him. If Troy was real, what other myths are memories? How many legends that we've dismissed as invention are actually history, dressed up and half forgotten? Troy didn't just put one city back on the map. It made us wonder how much real history is hiding inside the stories we stopped believing. And speaking of things we got wrong, the next one isn't about a place we underestimated. It's about an entire age we dismissed as savage. 4. Sutton Hoo. The Dark Ages that weren't dark. We call them the Dark Ages for a reason. The centuries in Europe after Rome fell were supposed to be a black hole. Crude, illiterate, impoverished barbarians stumbling through the mud, having lost everything Rome built. Then, in 1939, on a quiet English estate called Sutton Hoo, an archaeologist excavating a grassy burial mound found the ghost of a ship, an 80-foot long ship, its wood long rotted away, but its shape pressed perfectly into the soil, every iron rivet still in place. And inside, incredibly untouched by grave robbers across 13 centuries, a royal burial chamber sealed since the 7th century. What came out shattered the whole Dark Ages story. A war helmet of iron and tinned bronze, fierce and intricate, now one of the most famous objects in the world. Gold shoulder clasps inlaid with garnet cut so finely it takes a microscope to appreciate. A purse of gold coin, silver from the Eastern Mediterranean, weapons, drinking horns, treasure from a culture connected by trade across half the known world. This wasn't the grave of a mud-dwelling savage. This was the burial of a king, around the year 625, of a society with breathtaking craftsmanship, long-distance trade, and wealth. The find rewrote the rules. The so-called Dark Ages weren't dark at all. They were brilliant, and we'd simply lost the light to see them by. The people we'd written off as backward were anything but. Sound familiar? It's the same mistake again, assuming the people before us were lesser when the dirt keeps proving they weren't. And nowhere is that mistake more famous than the next one, which gets the single most memorized date in all of history flat out wrong. 5. Lançaos Meadows, who really reached America first. Everyone learns the date, 1492, Columbus, the man who reached the Americas. It was one of the most certain facts in every history book on Earth. It's also wrong by about 500 years. On a windswept tip of Newfoundland in Canada, a Norwegian couple, following clues buried in old Viking sagas, stories everyone had treated as myth again, found low mounds in the turf that the locals called the Indian camps. They dug, and underneath were the unmistakable remains of a Viking settlement, timber and turf longhouses, identical to those in Norse Greenland and Iceland, a forge, iron nails, iron slag from smelting, something no indigenous American culture did, and a weaving loom. For 8 years, they excavated in brutal weather, uncovering 8 buildings, a forge, the first known iron smelting in the New World. This was real, hard, accepted proof. Norse seafarers crossed the Atlantic and built on the North American continent around the year 1000, roughly 5 centuries before Columbus was even born. The first Europeans in the New World were Vikings, and they did it in open wooden boats. It rewrote the single most famous date in the history of exploration, and it carried that same quiet lesson once more. A saga everyone dismissed as legend turned out to be a map. The Vikings didn't stay. Distance and conflict with the people already there drove them back across the ocean. But for a few short years, 1,000 years ago, Norse fires burned on American soil, and the textbooks never knew. The next site, you already think you know. It's one of the most famous in the world, but the ending you were taught is wrong. 6. Pompeii, the survivor's history forgot. You know the story of Pompeii. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted, buried the Roman city under ash and rock, and froze its people forever. Those haunting plaster casts of bodies curled in their final moments. The city died, the story ends, everyone moved on. That was the accepted ending for almost 2,000 years, except recent excavations rewrote the ending. Archaeologists found clear evidence that after the eruption, after the ash settled and the city was a gray tomb, people came back. Some survivors of the disaster and others drawn by what was left behind returned to live in the ruins of Pompeii. They dug down into the buried upper floors of houses that still poked above the ash. They camped among the dead in a half-buried gray landscape where the rooftops of a dead city still broke the surface of the ash. For generations, a makeshift, half-buried shanty town clung to the corpse of the city, scavenging what the volcano hadn't taken. It's a small correction next to rewriting the dawn of civilization, but it's a haunting one, because it changes the whole emotional shape of the story. Pompeii wasn't a clean, sealed tragedy that ended in a single afternoon. Life crawled back into the ash and kept going in the shadow of the mountain that had killed everyone they knew. History rarely ends as neatly as the textbook wants it to. Even here, in the most famous disaster of the ancient world, the real story was messier, stranger, and more human than we were ever told. Which brings us, finally, full circle, back to Turkey and to a place that breaks the most basic rule of all, what a city even is. 7. Çatalhöyük, the city with no streets. We finish with the thing all of this was leading toward, the birth of the city itself. But this city breaks the rules of what a city is even supposed to be. Çatalhöyük is around 9,000 years old, one of the oldest urban settlements ever found. thousands of people living packed together. And yet it has no streets. None. No roads, no alleys, no public squares, no grand temples, no palaces, no sign of kings or rulers at all. Instead, mud brick houses built wall to wall against each other in a dense honeycomb, with no doors at ground level. People entered through holes in the roofs, climbing down ladders into their homes, and walked across the rooftops of the whole town as their streets. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their own houses, sleeping above their ancestors. They covered their walls with paintings and the horns of wild bulls. Here's how it rewrote the rules. We assumed the first cities had to grow the way ours did, with central authority, social hierarchy, a ruler at the top organizing everyone below. Çatalhöyük is a city of thousands that seems to have had no rulers, no rich and poor districts, no center of power, every household roughly equal. It forces a question we still can't fully answer. How does a city that size hold together for over 1,000 years with no one in charge? It rewrites one of our deepest assumptions, that civilization requires a boss, that someone always has to be on top for the rest to function. For over 1,000 years, thousands of people here proved otherwise. And that's a fitting place to end, because it's the same thread running through all 7 of these places. Look at what these 7 sites have in common. Every single time, the textbook said one thing, and the ground said another. Stone Age farmers were primitive. Newgrange says they tracked the sun with a precision we'd struggled to match. China's only Bronze Age cradle was the Yellow River. Sanxingdui says it wasn't. Troy was a myth. The walls say it was real. The Dark Ages were backward. Sutton Hoo's gold says they were brilliant. Columbus reached America first. The Vikings beat him by 500 years. Pompeii died in an afternoon. People came back and lived in its ashes. Cities need rulers. Çatalhöyük didn't have any. And notice the pattern underneath the pattern. Almost every time, the mistake ran the same direction. We assumed the people before us were simpler than they were, less capable, less connected, less intelligent, less than us, and almost every time, the dirt proved the opposite. So here's the thought I can't shake. If the textbooks were this wrong this many times about things we've now dug up and held in our hands, how much are they still wrong about? Sitting in the ground we haven't turned over yet. How many more chapters are waiting to be rewritten? The human past is not a settled story. Which of these 7 hit you hardest? The one that made you rethink what you were taught? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. See you next time.